good afternoon, or good morning, or whatever time of day it is from the place you are listening. Excuse me, I'm just going to make sure I'm unmuted. Okay. I'm happy to be here with all of you. And when I was preparing this reflection, I learned that there's a lot going on in these early days of ordinary time that we are in the liturgical season of the Catholic Church. This coming Sunday is the 6th Sunday of Ordinary Time, February 13th. It's also the World Day of the Sick. Next Sunday, in concert with upcoming Valentine's Day, the Church celebrates the World Day of Marriage. And just a few weeks ago, we celebrated the World Day of Consecrated Life. I was thinking about these commemorations as we begin this series of 5 Lectio Divina reflections using the lens of synodality. As Sister Judy explained in her introduction, the Baltimore Carmel began their reflections on synodality at the beginning of the liturgical year, this past Advent. That was just a little over a month after Pope Francis announced the opening of the first phase of the synod, which would run from October 2021 through April of this year. This will then lead up to the Assembly of Bishops in Synod in October of 2023. There were 2 important documents that were issued on the day that the Pope announced the opening of this preparatory synod. One is called the Vade Mecum, or the Way of Proceeding, and is designed as a handbook that accompanies the preparatory document, the second document, which is put at the service of the synodal journey in whatever contexts these journeying together are taking place. They're complementary, and I would encourage you to take a look at them on the resource page that is found on the Baltimore Carmel website. And also a whole host of videos and books and articles that are on the synod and synodality, and in particular this synod on synodality. I'm not going to say much about synodality. I hope that will come into our discussion when we move into our breakout groups. But as I understand my task today, it's to lift up some insights from this Sunday's gospel, which might serve as frameworks from which to share our experience of church today, to listen to one another's experience in order to discern together where the Spirit is leading us as the people of God. Many commentators writing about the synod have noted that although we are reviving a very ancient practice in the church, as well as returning to the original inspiration of the Second Vatican Council by walking this path together, for that is what synod means, we will in effect be taking part in a revolution in the way we do church. This is a once in a generation moment, perhaps the largest consultation in human history. All of us are invited to be part of this discernment. And the path of synodality means we are all journeying together in a new way of collaboration. It is the next stage of implementing Vatican II and involves a great deal of faith and trust that the Holy Spirit is leading us. In 2018, at the Synod on Young People, the Pope said that the purpose of this synod is to plant dreams, to draw forth prophecy and vision, to allow hope to flourish, to inspire, to bind up wounds, and to weave together new relationships. So how might our gospel lesson for this Sunday help us in this process? Well, I began to think that it might be well to review the several episodes that precede the passage for today's gospel that we just heard. They will remind us of the developing antipathy between Jesus and the religious leaders, the scribes or the teachers of the law, and the Pharisees, who are always watching him, questioning him for his association with undesirables, tax collectors, and sinners. The authorities compared Jesus's disciples to those of John the Baptist, and he found them wanting, even scandalous, for violating the laws regarding hand washing and their general laxity about fasting and praying. Last Sunday's gospel was the story of the calling of the first disciples, Simon, James, and John, and the miraculous catch of fish that stirred not only amazement, but terror. Recall Peter's reaction. Lord, depart from me, for I am a sinful man. But we also heard the simple and reassuring words of Jesus. Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people. And then Luke records, and they left everything and followed him. I don't know about you, but that is an amazing reaction. Chapter 5, before our passage for today, contains the passage about the paralyzed man who had sought healing from Jesus, but had to be let down through the roof by his friends because the crowd was so large. And Jesus tells him his sins are forgiven, further raising the hackles of the religious authorities, who don't directly confront Jesus, but raise questions among themselves. Who is this who is speaking blasphemies? But Jesus is perceptive and turns their question into a riddle about which is easier, saying his sins are forgiven or telling him to stand up and walk. Of course, Jesus demonstrates that he has been given the power to forgive, yet at the same time tells the man to stand up, take his bed, and go home. Jesus not only does something dramatic that amazes his disciples, but Luke says amazement seized all of them, and they glorified God and were in awe. We have seen strange things today. This then is followed by another call story, that of Levi, the tax collector, who also, quote, left everything and followed him. More encounters with religious authorities follow until we hear that Jesus goes up to the mountain to pray. And having spent the night in prayer, calls the 12. That symbolic term that singles out these particular disciples who are then ever after are going to be called apostles because they were sent out, which is the word apostolos, from which our word apostle comes from. Sent out to preach the good news. So I tell that background because I think it's important, given the current situation in the church with regard to the possible reception of this call for a turning point, in a sense, in the history of the church, a revolution, as some commentators have called it, because it means that Pope Francis, even among those closest in proximity to him, as we look at his attempts to reform the Curia, may not be completely receptive. So coming to verse 17 in chapter 6, where today's gospel starts, Luke has Jesus coming down from the mountain, as Sister Judy said, to a level place, which gives rise to why today's passage is often called the Sermon on the Plain. This differs from Matthew's account in chapter 5, verses 1 to 11, where Jesus has, where Matthew has Jesus like Moses going up the mountain. And this is the place where Luke is most closely following Matthew's gospel regarding the use of the term beatitude or blessing or Macarism, from the Greek word makarios. Sometimes this is translated as happy, but I think the word blessed is probably more accurate in our context. Matthew creates a rather dramatic parallel, deliberately putting Jesus and Moses together. Jesus is the new Moses. For Luke, Jesus is not so much Moses, the lawgiver, but Moses, the prophet. Recall that Jesus's first public address in the synagogue echoed the prophet Isaiah in chapter 4 of Luke. There are both similarities and differences between Matthew and Luke, and scholars point out that they are drawing in large part from the hypothetical saying source that scholars call Q. That is a short way of referring to the German term for source or Quelle. And Q is a hypothetical source because it's looking at the places in Matthew and Luke's gospel that are in common with one another, sometimes almost word for word, but are not found in John or Mark. Q simply means source, but the audience of Matthew's and Luke's are also different, and this accounts for the way each has constructed these sayings. Matthew has 9 blessings, sometimes we might say 8 or 9, and Luke has only 4. In Matthew, Jesus sees the crowds, but speaks more pointedly just to the disciples. In Luke, too, it is the disciples who are the primary audience, but the multitude who is there is clearly implicitly listening, as indicated in the verse we don't hear in today's lectionary passage. Our passage today ends at verse 26, but in verse 27 in the whole gospel, Luke says, "I say to you who are listening," which is a pointed directive to what is perhaps one of the most difficult and prophetic commands of Jesus. This is also in verse 27. That's not here this week. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Another difference between Matthew and Luke's Beatitudes is that the poor are not spiritualized in Luke. They are the really economically impoverished, the real despicables, as Jose Pugola likes to call them, the ones who represent all those who are marginalized. And Jesus says, it is to these that the reign of God belongs. Luke's blessings are presented with an emphasis on divine reversal. The present condition will be turned around in the future. You who now hunger will be satisfied. You who now are weeping will laugh. It's interesting that that word laugh in Greek, galao, is found only in this passage in the New Testament. In the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, its usage occurs in contexts that are describing a derisive nuance, such as laughing at or being laughed at. So perhaps Luke intends here a really sort of triumphal reversal, where those who have been victimized will have the last laugh. The 3 verbs used here in the last blessing in Luke's version, hate, exclude, insult, all indicate the experience of rejection, the experience that awaits the disciple who follows Jesus. Again, we have a word that is used only once. And by the way, if you want to sound very scholarly and erudite, this is called a hapax legominam. It's a term that in graduate school I used to like to say a number of times because it just sounds so cool. That is a word that's used only one time in this particular passage. And that's the term aphorizo, which means set aside or segregated, again, clearly indicating marginalization. The term anadizo, translated to be insulted, implies a verbal scorning. And as Luke Timothy Johnson points out in his commentary, Luke is describing a movement from attitude to action to speech. And having one's name denounced as evil is more than just name calling, since the concept of one's name in the Hebrew understanding meant one's identity, and to have it denounced or cast out implies a kind of ironic exorcism that a follower of Jesus would undergo on the account of the Son of Man, on account of the Son of Man. The almost preposterous summons in view of these fates is to rejoice and leap for joy. In fact, the word almost means dance, for God will reward you in heaven. Nevertheless, Luke's audience is reminded that they will be treated as followers of Jesus the same way the prophets were treated by their ancestors. The final difference between Matthew and Luke's Beatitudes, however, is that Matthew's does not include the woes that we hear at the end of today's passage. And the woes in Luke's passage, Luke's Beatitudes, have the same internal structure as his blessings. The two members of each set, if you have your Lexio card, are kind of contrast or parallels. Woe to the woe to the rich, blessed are the poor. Woe to the filled, blessed are the hungry now. Woe to those who laugh now, blessed are those who weep, for they will laugh. Woe to those who are praised, blessed are the excluded, for their reward will be great. These outer statements describe the present realities that will be transformed. The rich, secure, and powerful are rejected, but the poor possess the reign of God. This pattern of acceptance and rejection takes a reverse image in the final blessing and woe. The ones who are rejected by other humans are accepted by God. The ones accepted by human standards are like the false prophets. The lesson is that God is at work in the kind of prophetic visitation that Jesus teaches, and which is at the heart of the reign of God. We are called to transform our way of seeing and called to scrutinize our perceptions from a different scale, one which will often be diametrically opposed to the way things are, that perennially go unquestioned and unheeded. So what does this passage have to do with this recent announcement of Pope Francis about having a synod on synodality, the announcement that he made this past September? I was asked to relate today's Lectio to this worldwide undertaking. As Sister Judy said in the beginning, which sounds rather new, but it's really a return to a very ancient practice of the church. In some ways, it's like a reversal of the usual way of proceeding. Sorry, I lost my place in my text. That Catholics have come to expect from the past synods that we have witnessed. Even though synods were revived by Pope Paul VI at the end of the Second Vatican Council, they have mostly been sort of almost predictable gatherings. The representatives of the bishops were there. Once in a while, there would be some outside consultants, but they could not have been considered as representative as this synod on synodality is expected to be. So given that the whole thrust of Vatican II was that the whole people of God is a communion, a joint membership of every individual by virtue of the sacrament of baptism, I'd like to suggest that as we share our reflections on what these beatitudes, these promises of reversal that we hear in Luke's Sermon on the Plain today, that we might think also of our own baptism we don't perhaps think of our baptism as being the most important event of our lives. Even those who have made a life of consecration and made vows, the vows are simply intensification. The whole life is the intensification of one's baptism. And in my own parish, actually, through the instrument of just one woman's suggestion, we've been asked to tell the parish staff what was the date of our baptism. And they have a record of that. And in the bulletin every week, we have a listing not of the person's birthdays that are being celebrated, but those who are celebrating the anniversary of their baptism. And this, of course, was at the heart of Vatican II, which was emphasizing the church as the people of God. That is not only the hierarchy, that is not only putting together the hierarchy and the laity, but in fact, the whole of humanity is meant to be the people of God. And so in recalling that, the understanding of baptism was that every baptized person, so we're talking about the members of the church now, participate in the priestly, prophetic, and this is a hard word to figure out a better translation, kingly or royal feature of basically of what our baptism incorporates us into. I think the best way of understanding that kingly or royal today is to think about the role or charism of leadership, of being at the head of various kinds of groups of people, beginning with our family or whatever other group in which we find ourselves as members of the church. So let us think about these steps that are involved in coming to understand what it means to really listen to one another, to listen for the Spirit speaking in each other, to also not shy away from bringing up our dreams, but also those wounds that might need to be healed. As we begin our discussion, which is going to be explained to us in our small groups. Thank you.